All right, so thank you everybody for joining our CMMI webinar, the transition from version 1.3 to version 2.0. Please feel free to send in some questions throughout the presentation. We will leave time at the end to go over them. And if you can, within the next few minutes, just go ahead and answer this poll so I can get Floyd and Jim those results. And with that, Floyd and Jim, if you want to take over, we can go ahead and get the presentation started.
Okay. Thanks, Macy, and thank you all for taking the time and for giving us the opportunity to speak to you. So I'm guessing this audience is probably aware of the hard crossover to V2.0 model for appraisals that will occur in September of this year. And you're attending this webinar today so you can understand the impact of that change. We recognize this need for information, and so we created this presentation to cut through the CMMI speak and simplify the unnecessary complexity built around the new model. My name is Floyd Capistrano. I'm the VP of Programs here at Alluvionic. My co-presenter is Mr. Jim Holden. He is a senior process consultant with the firm. Mrs. Wendy Mayo is Alluvionic's president and CEO. So both Jim and I have been involved with helping numerous firms achieve their CMMI process improvement initiatives, and we've been following and analyzing the V2.0 model since its release. So to frame our discussion, let's define the scope and objective of the presentation. The scope is going to include a discussion of the differences between the old and new model, and it's really geared toward an audience with a good grasp of 1.3. So that's why we kind of put that poll out there. It'll be very important for you to understand basic terms like maturity level, process areas, PID, etc., because we won't be going into too much detail in those areas. The objective of our talk is to give the audience an understanding of the changes between the old and new models and how it impacts the accreditation process moving forward. So now that we're all on the same page, here's the agenda list for the discussion. In the terms introduction section, we'll be translating the V2.0 terms and how they relate to the 1.3 terminology. In the representation section, we'll go over the model structure and how it is used to scope the appraisal approach, and we'll walk through an example. In the process practice section, we will show how the new version maps to the old and provide details into the changes. And finally, in the appraisal considerations section, we will go over details of the new appraisal methodology, and we'll walk through an example to help drive that home. All right, so let's get started with term introduction. All right, with the new model, a few of the 1.3 terms were simply relabeled. So if you see the table on screen, V1.3 terms on the left and 2.0 on the right. You'll see process areas are now just called practice areas, and specific practices are now just practices. The term specific goals was eliminated, is no longer defined within the V2.0 model. And at the bottom of the table, you'll notice two new practice areas are introduced, and they replace the generic goals and practices. These are the practice areas of governance and implementation infrastructure. In the old model, there were complaints, I guess, of duplication of effort when leveraging the generic goals and practices across all process areas. So these new PAs were created to address these issues. Just a heads up, Jim and I will be using the acronym PA when referring to process or practice areas moving forward throughout the presentation. Just gets a little tiring saying practice and process areas all the time, so just know that. Okay, moving into the topic of constellation and views. If you recall, in the previous version, there were predefined representations of the model called constellations. Now, these were used to target specific areas of process improvement, and these were typically what was stipulated in RFPs. They included the constellations of development, services, and acquisition. Now, the new version introduces the term view and defines specific views for development, services, and supplier management. But you can see these are basically synonymous with the old V1.3 constellations as indicated by the arrows. So we're going to move into the next topic, representations for scoping the appraisal. Now, when we refer to scoping the appraisal, we're basically talking about which view and what maturity level your firm is desiring to pursue. So this slide describes a fundamental shift in how the new model determines applicable practices given the desired view and maturity level. So on screen, the V1.3 model on the left uses a concept of stage representation. And the logic here starts with the selection of the desired constellation. In our example, and example throughout the presentation, we'll use the development constellation. The firm then decides which maturity level they want to achieve. Now, from there, the stage representation groupings automatically basically determines what specific set of process areas will be addressed and their relevant specific goals and practices. Now, in a similar fashion, the V2.0 model starts with choosing a view. Again, we'll use the development view. But then it departs from the old method because by virtue of selecting the view, it actually determines the practice areas that are relevant. Now, from there, the firm chooses maturity level, and by choosing maturity level, then determines the applicable practices. We'll drive this home a little further with an example in the next slide. All right, so here, again, the example is a firm seeking maturity level 3 for development. We're going to step through the logic discussed earlier. We'll start here with V1.3 stage representation of the model for development. The constellation is comprised of 22 process areas, as you can see on screen. But since we desire only maturity level of 3, only 18 PAs are applicable. And these are the ones labeled level 2 and 3 up there. Now, if you wanted to achieve a maturity level of 4, you would add the PAs of organizational process performance and quantitative project management. Similarly, if you wanted to achieve a maturity level of 5, you would then add to that organizational performance management, and causal analysis, and resolution. That's how the old model worked. So now, jumping over to the new model, you start with the development view. Now, the development view defines all the relevant practice areas. There are 20 practice areas in the view. A maturity level of 3 is desired, so all the practices within levels 1, 2, and 3 are applicable. Now, if you wanted to achieve a maturity level 4, you would address 6 specific PAs with level 4 requirements. Additionally, if you wanted to reach a level 5 maturity, you would address 2 PAs with level 5 requirements. So you can see that there's a little bit of difference in how the logic works with the two different models. In a similar fashion, the services representation shown on screen, it works a similar way. Note that there are 22 practice areas in the service view versus 20 in the development view. All right, so here we're going to drill down into a specific practice area to further solidify the concept. Shown on screen is the V1.3 PA called project planning. It is a maturity level 2 PA. Since our firm is interested in maturity level 3 accreditation, all the practices apply. Now, the equivalent PA in the V2.0 model is planning. As shown in the previous slides, a new model groups practices into maturity level, and planning happens to have 4 levels of maturity. So a firm seeking maturity level of 3 would only concern themselves with practices in levels 1, 2, 3. They would not necessarily address the practices in level 4. All right. So that kind of goes through how the model works. With that, we're going to move into what the differences are in the structure. So with this slide, we're going to highlight the differences between the old and new model and introduce the concept of capability areas, which is a new concept. On screen, we have the V1.3 structure on the left and the 2.0 on the right. The V1.3 categories include service establishment and delivery, project and work management, process management, and support. Each category has specific processes assigned to it, and subsequently each process area has specific and general goals and practices. The V2.0 also starts off with categories, except they've been redefined as doing, managing, enabling, and improving. And then the 2.0 structure introduces this new subgroup called capability areas. There are 10 capability areas shown here on the right. Now each capability area is assigned to one of the 4 categories, and each contains specific practice areas, which in turn contain the practices. It might be a little bit confusing, so I'm going to walk through the next couple slides to graphically depict what was just mentioned and hopefully clear things up. So here we'll start with the categories of doing and managing. And within the doing category, we have the capability areas of delivering, managing services, engineering and developing products, ensuring quality, and selecting and managing suppliers. Now, within the DMS capability area, we have the practice areas of service delivery management and strategic service management. In the EDP category, we have 2 practice areas, PI and TS. And similarly with the other 2 capability areas, they have their practice areas inside of them. Managing has a capability area of managing business resilience, managing the workforce, and planning and mapping work. Inside managing business resilience capability area, you've got 3 practice areas: continuity, incident resolution prevention, risk and opportunity management. Managing the workforce has only 1 practice area called organizational training, and planning and mapping work has 3. The other 2 categories, enabling and improving. Enabling has 1 capability area with 3 practice areas, and improving has 2 capability areas, and you can see the practice areas within in those capability areas. So hopefully that might have cleared things up for you. So now that you have the foundation for the new model, you know how it works and how it's structured, we'll now move into some of the specific differences within the practice areas. And in this section, I'll be handing over the controls to Mr. Jim Holden, who will walk us through these details. So let me give Jim the control here. All right, Jim. Thank you.
Yep, I'm in. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go through the process/practice areas and show you how they map and what some of the major updates and changes are. I noticed in the poll that a few people aren't too familiar with V1.3, but hopefully this will be informational, and if you have even some basic knowledge, it'll be easy to follow. So as soon as I get my little control working here. So the big difference between, one of the big differences, as Floyd's alluded to, is the fact that in the models now, they, all practice areas apply at all levels. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we move further down. But what they did was they also did some regrouping of the model. In the process areas, as we group it on the left-hand side, the V1.3 model for development, they had these different process areas, like there was measurement analysis, organizational process performance, and organizational performance management. And that's all now lumped together in something called managing performance and measurement. And that managing performance and measurement, as Floyd just talked about, has 5 levels to it. And that's how come so the 2 high performance process areas before, organizational process performance and organizational performance management, are now just a part of this managing performance and measurement at 5 different levels, depending upon where you want to be. Similarly, they took all the planning and monitoring and what was called integrated project management, which was a level 3 process. They put them all together and said we've now just got estimating, planning, and monitoring control, which actually makes it easier. One of the things I think was one of the best changes they made was they took requirements development, requirements management, which was always kind of a juggling act as to where's requirements traceability and things like that belong, and they put that into one called requirements development management, so it's all one thing. They took verification and validation. What they did there, and we'll talk about in a minute, is they basically pulled out peer reviews, which was buried inside of verification. Now peer reviews is its own process area. The organizational things, they just kind of renamed them, the definition and focus. Risk management, they added opportunities. We'll talk about that again. They changed PPQA to just quality assurance, process quality assurance. And then most of the other ones, they basically left alone. And then as we mentioned, for the they added governance and they added implementation infrastructure. And I don't know if people are familiar with the ISO or AS 9100 standards, but the governance practice area has a very big ISO spin to it, where it's looking at management commitment and things such as that. So here was how they mapped them, and so they've changed the groupings and put them together a little differently. But essentially, all the same requirements are there. Plus, there's this governance, which is new, and it is, like I said, very AS or ISO, if you're familiar with that, where it talks about management commitment. So here now I'm just going to go through one by one and kind of look at what the updates were and what the critical changes were. So if you're looking and you were a V1.3 appraised organization, this is what you're going to have to look to change in your current processes in order to be able to pass a V2.0 appraisal. So as I said, process asset development replaces the organizational process definition. It now requires organizations to be able to manage their assets at all levels 1 through 3. Where before, if you were level 2, you didn't have to have an organizational process asset kind of infrastructure in place. Now it requires you as levels 1 and 2 to have that. And it also now requires you to have a strategy for building and updating assets of a very specific process architecture defined. And you have to have organizational measurement and analysis standards, which is different. Before, you usually had organizational measurement specified, but now you have to have actually measurement analysis standards. So these are some changes there. Process management been replaced the organizational process focus. The big changes there is now requires identifications of processes that are the largest contributors to meeting business objectives. And this is, again, a focus change in the CMMI models. Before, the focus used to be on compliance, and now it's focusing on performance. And when they look at performance, they're now looking very, almost you'll see it all the time, they're looking at business objectives and how does the performance of the process map to achieving business objectives. And it's a whole focus shift, it's a mindset shift, and you'll see that later in the appraisals that it also has taken that turn. Also, you have to have a process to explore new processes and such, and you have to evaluate the effectiveness of deployed improvements. Organizational training, nothing really changed there. It's basically a few word changes, but it's still pretty much exactly the same. Governance was the big change up here. And again, as I mentioned, the governance change is it requires senior management to define and communicate organizational needs and objectives, and to hold people accountable for adhering to those objectives. It has a much, this is where I said it has this AS 9100 ISO ring to it. So these are things, and one thing I should have started with, if you noticed up the top here, the process areas that are common in dev and services, which are now in the new model, the practice areas are now common. So the models share all this commonality of the practice areas, and then they merely add or delete practice areas for services or development. Implementation infrastructure really is where the GPs moved to, the generic practices. It took the one about 2.3 about providing resources, training people, talk 2.9 evaluating adherence and reviewing the status, and collecting experiences, i.e. like lessons learned. All that stuff that used to be in the generic practices is now reflected in this implementation infrastructure, which talks about those types of generic kind of things you have to do in order to establish and maintain a organizational process. Planning, the only change there was that in the new one was that it does not include the estimating, since that is, as Floyd pointed out, a new practice area. Estimating, again, is the new practice area that incorporates the estimating practices that used to be in project planning and integrated project management, but didn't substantially change anything. Monitoring and control, the only change there really was from the old, what they call PMC, project monitoring and control, was it added a requirement that you have to monitor the work environment. The biggest one in here, this thing about managing performance and measurement, where they consolidate the measurement and the high maturity analysis of measurement, is it now requires these operational definitions of measures, and these operational definitions have to specify where you get the data, where it comes from, what are the business objectives, and what are those objectives, you know, how are these measures related to those business objectives and things like that. And as I mentioned, this area now encompasses all the high maturity statistical analysis practices that used to be in V1.3. Risk and opportunity management, the biggest change there was, and this is now makes it CMMI consistent with AS 9100 and ISO, is it requires opportunities to be identified and tracked. So you have to have a means of identifying and tracking and mitigating or handling risks. And similarly, you have to have a methodology for identifying and tracking and implementing opportunities on the project, where, you know, risks have a negative impact and opportunities have the potential for a positive impact on the program. Okay. Configuration management. One of the things that I particularly liked about this was that many organizations, the concept of a configuration item was kind of a nebulous term. They didn't understand it unless you worked in the DoD world. Configuration item was not what I call the usual vernacular. So now it's changed the term configuration item to items to be placed under configuration management, which everybody kind of understands now. And but other than that, nothing changed. Supplier agreement management, they added one more function underneath of supplier agreement management to require that you show how you demonstrate how you are processing and tracking invoices. And that was never there before. It also requires you to select deliverable items for review and monitoring supplier process and deliverables based on criteria in the supplier agreement. So the supplier agreements now have to address this idea of, are we going to monitor your processes and deliverables, and which ones are we going to do? Process quality assurance. This one replaces the old PPQA, but effectively is pretty much the same. The only differences are that you have to define and develop a quality assurance approach and plan based on historical quality data. Before, that was kind of implied but never required, but now it's required that you actually look at the historical data, and when you come up with your quality plan for a project or the organization, it has to have analysis of historical data to kind of tell you how often you should be doing things. As an example, you know, if you find that all your projects are having issues with configuration management, then you would change your approach and plan for how you're going to do your quality audits to perhaps do CM more often than the other process areas. And you might do CM on a monthly basis on the projects until you find out that everybody gets it kind of under control, while you might have scheduled only quarterly audits before for all the other process areas. So that's the kind of thing they're looking for. And the other thing is that before, the quality assurance audits always identified the issues, but they never had to identify opportunities. And again, we're talking about how we improve the process and how we do a better job of meeting business objectives. So you have to record opportunities for improvement during these quality audits and quality assurance activities. Causal analysis and resolution has basically the same practices, but if you're familiar with the model, it was a level 5 process area. Well, now the same practices apply, but at different levels. So at level 1, it now requires you to identify and address causes of outcomes. You don't have to do it statistically or anything, but you have to have a process for how you do that. At level 2, instead of identifying and addressing, it says you have to now analyze and address causes of outcomes, which is a very subtle, as I like to say, slicing the bologna a little thinner. And then finally, at level 3, it requires you to determine root causes. You have to propose and select and implement action plans, and you have to record root cause analysis and submit improvement proposals based on those actions you took based on the root cause analysis. So if you find the root cause of something and you implement an action plan and that seems to fix it, then you would turn around and submit an improvement proposal to the organization, say, this is how we can fix and make this process better based on our causal analysis. So even now, everybody now will have to have some form of a causal analysis and resolution process, no matter what level you're at, and that was not true before. So decision analysis and resolution, essentially the same process of defining alternate solutions, the criteria, what's the method you're going to analyze, and then rating your selections and then choosing it. Except the only big thing they added was it now requires, at level 3, for you to have a decision authority to be defined. So before, you could make these decisions, but you didn't have to specify specifically what was the decision authority that would allow the selected alternative to go forward. Now you have to specifically define that. So for instance, if you were making a requirements decision, you may have defined your decision authority to be the program manager, the technical lead, and the customer. While if you're making a decision about design, it might only have to be the technical lead and the program manager and perhaps like a software lead or a hardware lead or something like that. So you have to define these decision authorities who will then vote or whatever it is. It could be one person and decide and approve the decision made. Peer reviews basically are the same thing. They were pulled out from verification, and it now requires you, though, to maintain the materials used to prepare for and perform peer reviews. Verification and validation combines verification and validation without any substantive changes. And that was always an issue where we know there's a difference between verification and validation, but in many cases, the verification and validation activities were one and the same thing, where effectively the customer was witnessing or it was being done on the actual hardware. And so they put those together, but you still have to have and clearly define what is your verification activity and what is your validation activity. And if they're different, then you have to have different plans and different tests and different results. As I mentioned, requirements development management, it combines requirements definition, the old RD, and the REQM, requirements management, and didn't make any substantive changes at all. It just grouped them together and put them together logically, and of course, stack them at what do you need to do at level 1, level 2, level 3. Okay, so those are all the areas that are now common between services or supplier management or development models or views. Then for process areas, if you're going for a development appraisal, these two practice areas apply. Technical solution, and the only difference there from the old technical solution, which talked about design and implementation and things such as that, is that it now requires you to do a formal or evaluation, a documented evaluation of the design and address any identified issues, which is now implying that you have to have some sort of a design review of some sort. And then product integration is pretty much the same thing again, except you have to, it requires an evaluation of the integrated components to ensure conformance to requirements, where before integration did not require that evaluation against conformance to requirements. So there's a little bit of more work there inside of product integration. So those are the only two ones in dev. And then as Floyd pointed out when he was talking about how many there were, and there were 24 practice, 24 practice areas for services. Here are the service ones. Service delivery management, which combined service delivery and service system transition, and now requires you to develop and use organizational standard service systems and agreements. So there have to be these standards that you use and when you come up with your service system and your service agreements in terms of your contracts, they have to be based on organizational standard service systems. Continuity, replace service continuity so there's no real change. Again, incident resolution and prevention, if you will, in the area like of help desks and things like that, and tickets, service requests. There's no substantive changes. Actually, it's a little less rigorous than it was before. There was a little more rigor and a little more prescriptive nature to what incident resolution and prevention was before, and now it's just a little looser, but still pretty much the same thing. And then finally, strategic service management is mapped to the old same thing, except that the only extra thing they require is an approach for providing new or changed services derived from strategic needs and capability. And again, it's drawing yourself back into this. What are the business needs? What are the strategic needs? What are the long-term goals? So that you develop an approach for developing new or updated services based on these strategic needs. So again, the focus of these practice areas and the focus of the model, and Floyd's going to talk about it a little bit, and you'll probably see a little bit of that coming up on the appraisals, is it's oriented towards business objectives rather than oriented towards, and performance improvements rather than being oriented towards compliance. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Floyd, and he will finish up talking about the appraisal considerations.
Thanks, Jim. All right, now I know that was really great detail onto some of the specifics about the changes, and I'm not sure if everybody got all that. But rest assured, we will be posting this webinar on our website. So it's recorded, so you'd be able to hear Jim's words and see the the presentation as well. Excuse me. So if you missed any of that, because I know it's a lot, don't fret. All right, so now we'll be moving on to the subject of appraisals. Okay, so in the new model, the CMMI Institute basically relabels and recycles appraisal terms. So see, referring to the table on the left-hand side are the 2.0, the new terms. As you can see, the SCAMPI A is now called benchmark appraisal. The SCAMPI C and B are replaced by the evaluation appraisal. And the sustainment action plan reappraisal terms are basically reused. There's some details about the sustainment appraisal. It is performed every 2 years. It's following a benchmark appraisal. So you have to do a benchmark appraisal first. And it's basically used to offset the impact of benchmark appraisals, which normally occur every 3 years. There's a maximum of 3 sustainment appraisals that can be conducted before another benchmark would be required. The action plan reappraisal, that gives the organizations who may narrowly miss the requirement or two during the appraisal process, gives them a second chance at delivering the requirement. But note that in order for you to do this, you need the CMMI Institute to approve you going forward with that reappraisal. All right. Now, although the change in terms don't have much impact on the appraisal process, there is a significant difference in how the CMMI Institute conducts appraisals with the new model. All right, in the original flow, the organization identifies the projects that meet certain appraisal requirements and the ones they feel are indicative of how projects are conducted. They define the scope for the projects being considered. So, for example, development projects under contract are fair game, but maybe IRAD projects are out of scope. They establish an appraisal plan, identify the PA coverage, Then the lead appraiser submits the plan to the institute, where am I at? So they submit the plan, and the institute approves and issues the accreditation. Now, the 2.0 appraisal flow starts out in a similar way, where they define the scope, establishes an appraisal plan, submits the plan, gets approval from the institute. But it really departs with regards to project selection. The activities highlighted in yellow describe those specific deltas. So here in the new model, the firm has to generate what they call a project inventory. Now that is comprised of all the projects within the scope of the appraisal. Now this list is submitted to the institute by the lead appraiser, and the institute does a random selection to generate a list of projects that will be audited. Now, the bottom line here is, in the past, the firm seeking accreditation had the ability to control which projects the lead appraiser would review, and the appraisal team will review. Now, because every project in an inventory can be selected, every project must now be prepared to be audited. So it's a little bit of, there's a lot more work there. But I guess in the institute's rationale, if you're truly a mature company and you're following your processes, then this shouldn't be an issue, because all your projects should be following it. We'll go into a little bit more details into the individual boxes. The first box, activity of generating a project inventory. So the organization, based on the defined scope of the appraisal, will identify all the projects that apply, and they'll separate them into project subgroups. The lead appraiser will collect all that information, that project list. They'll formally submit it to the CMMI Institute for consideration. Then the institute will randomly select projects and associate them to capability areas for which they'll be subject to audit. They'll communicate this selection back to the lead appraiser, and the lead appraiser will in turn communicate that back to the organization. Just a general note on the bottom of the table there, the PID is a tool for facilitating the Scampi appraisals. That's no longer a requirement as it was in the past. The appraisals can now take a show and tell format similar to ISO audits, where maybe the affirmation and documentation can occur at the same session. All right, so let's put this process flow in action with an example. So again, the scenario is a firm seeking maturity level 3 accreditation for development. In here, in this example, the firm has 24 projects in their inventory. They've divided these projects into 3 subgroups, A, B, C, based on the size, large, medium, small, and they've justified that with a dollar amount for the projects. So they've got their inventory, they've got them subgrouped per the guideline on the bottom left table. An inventory of 24 projects means the CMMI Institute will randomly select 2 projects within each capability area. So here's an example of a sample assignment. Here, for example, the capability area of engineering and development products, EDP, the project 3 of subgroup A was selected, and project 14 of subgroup B was selected. Now remember, the EDP capability area has 2 practice areas within it, product integration and technical solutions. So naturally, both of these projects will be evaluated against practices within each of those practice areas. Just some additional information, although not shown in this example, it is possible for a project to be represented by multiple capability areas, especially in cases where maybe there aren't a good number of projects. Project number is limited, so obviously you'd have to be able to prove you're following the processes with less projects, and meaning they'd have to be able to be reassigned to duplicate capability areas. This slide here basically drives home the advantage of performing sustainment appraisals. As you can see on the table here, only a third of the PAs highlighted in the red columns are evaluated in depth, meaning close examination of objective evidence. The remaining PAs are just evaluated at a high level, where basically just enough activities performed to confirm the intent and value of the practice group is satisfied. The bottom line here is these appraisals are less impact to the organization, they require less time, and they have lower costs because of it. So some final notes on the appraisal details. As we said earlier, benchmark appraisal can be followed by a maximum of 3 consecutive sustainment appraisals before another benchmark is required. The practices both in governing and implementation infrastructure are applied to the organizational processes and their implementation in projects. The third one is really important here. The project inventory can be submitted earlier than 60 days prior to the benchmark appraisal date, and no later than 30 days before the appraisal date. So there's a window that you have to meet to supply your project inventory, and you only really have 30 days to prep before the benchmark appraisal happens. So obviously your projects have to be all in order, because 30 days isn't much time. A single project substitution can be requested. So, like we said, they do a random selection, and if you don't like that selection, you can request a project substitution, but that just restarts the whole random selection project, random selection again. It will repeat. And as a final slide, we do want you to know that Alluvionic does offer some help with getting accredited. We provide a gap analysis service for firms who simply want to assess their organization against the CMMI controls. With that, we'll review key information from project artifacts. We'll conduct interviews to understand organizational process and practices. We'll determine the capability, compliance against the model, and we'll define recommendations and next steps to fully meet the requirements. On the right is an example of a scorecard we produced for the analysis outbrief. It contains scores for the completeness of documentation, process and procedures. We've got scores for implementation of organization processes and scores for implementation of project processes. We can follow this up with a remediation project plan to get your firm appraisal ready. And then we can also facilitate obtaining a CMMI certified lead appraiser to conduct the formal appraisal process. So with that, brings us to the question and discussion section, and we'll open the floor to those. Macy, did we have any on the message board?
Yeah, we have a few questions here. Get them pulled up. Okay, so our first question is, how long will the CMMI Institute take to respond to a project inventory submittal?
So they're claiming 1 or 2 day turnaround. That's the word on the street.
Okay. So for our next one, we have, is the project documentation to be submitted to CMMI Institute as a part of the project inventory?
I can answer that, Floyd. No, you don't submit the documentation. The documentation still works just like it was before in the old days of V1.3. You keep that and gather that to support the appraisal. The inventory list is just a list of the projects, and along with that inventory list is information about what phase of the program the project is in and things like that. So the interesting thing that Floyd alluded to is that you have to have project documentation available on site when they do the appraisal for the process areas, or I'm sorry, for the practice areas that the CMMI Institute picks out of their random selection process. And you only, before, if you're familiar with V1.3 again, it used to be able, people took 3 to 6 months to prepare this objective evidence matrix called a PID that demonstrated the project was doing it. Well, now basically you'll have probably as little as 30 days from the time they tell you which practice areas you're going to have to do until the appraisal starts. And the most you could have is probably about 55 days. So it's not like the old days where the PID, you prepare and that's one of the reasons they took the PID out, is they don't expect you to prepare one. They expect to be able to come in and just start asking questions and look at data, and that data should be available. So it's a big change because the projects now have to be basically up to snuff across the board, such that when this random sample comes in, they can provide the documentation the CMMI Institute has said we want to see from that particular project.
It looks like we have another one here. With the earliest submittal of the project inventory capped at 60 calendar days, companies have less time than before to prepare for the appraisal. Is this negotiable?
Yeah, no, the CMI is holding firm to that 60 days. Yeah, so not negotiable.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, and Floyd mentioned, that was done on purpose because they realized that, if you will, people were cherry picking the projects for the appraisal, and that they might pick 2 or 3 really good projects, but the other maybe 5 or 6 they had weren't really following the process very well, and they could basically hide those. And the goal was, if you're institutionalized and you have the processes are institutionalized, you should show it, be able to show it for every program anytime.
Yep.
All right, and we'll do one more question before we end the webinar. So that is, can a firm be appraised for both development and services at the same time?
Yeah, you want to go into detail of that, Jim?
Sure. Yes, you can do both at the same time. The mechanism for that is it's called a multimodal model appraisal, and basically you would go through and show all the process area. You would demonstrate all the practice areas for the services model and all the practice areas for the dev model, and but it does cut some time out of the appraisal itself, because you don't have to repeat like organizational things, and you don't have to repeat some of the high level project things, even though a services project and a development project would have different evidence in terms of planning and such. They could have very similar metrics. They certainly could have some similarity in how they do risk management, which would simplify the appraisal, but you can do them both at the same time.
Yeah, there may be some cost benefits versus doing 2 separate appraisals, one for dev and one for services. If you can combine them, like Jim said, there are some overlaps, so there might be some cost savings there as well.
Right.
All right, perfect. Well, we'll end on that note, but thank you everybody for coming to our webinar today. I will be sending out the slides later this afternoon for you. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments, concerns. So thank you, Jim and Floyd.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Take care.
All right. Thank you all. Bye.